Good morning. Wednesday, January 14th. We are going to spend our morning here focused on big picture, the yield bill. What decisions we'll need to make in order to pass a yield bill in March, and to some degree why we are where we are. And we have both Julia Richter and the Agency of Education here. The Agency of Education, I invited them in to talk about what people are spending, what districts are spending their money on, essentially. And then this afternoon, we have a brief visit from the tax department to talk about the request and budget adjustment related to some legislation we passed a number of years ago. At 1:45, we're going to hear from the Department of Fish and Wildlife about a new fee that they have created. They have statutory authority to create that fee. But I think there's still a question about whether it's appropriate to both have that statutory authority and whether a new fee is appropriate at this time. And then we're going to do our report, our list of reports and who wants to read what. And that's it for the day. Anyone have anything they would like to say, do? Cool. Julia, you're up. Thanks.
I should probably tell you, Madam Chair, that today is the second day in a row that I forgot to plug in my hearing aids overnight. So I don't have them in to probably can.
Oh, great.
I
Okay.
really want my attention. Yeah.
You sound good to us.
Good morning, Julia Richter, JFO. Do you want me to try to speak loudly?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, the teacher voice.
I will try to project. Let me know if I'm not projecting enough.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's my own age that made me forget, not yours, not your.
And I think there are lots of people with various hearing in the committee, and we have people watching at home. And I think it's just even more reason to not have crosstalk and to make sure that we're really taking turns speaking.
Good point.
Okay, so Julia Richter, JFO. I have a bunch of documents on the committee page under my name that the chair has prepared for today. Would you like me to start with the yield bill decision points and then go from there?
Yeah, and I'm trying, given all the different pieces of a puzzle that we're going to be working on this year, I've really asked staff as much as possible to be framing our work in terms of decision points that we need to be making or that we can make. Yes.
Before we start, just, are we gonna have broader discussions about the yield bill? Or are we only gonna be talking about the decision points that are brought up right now?
And we're going to be talking about the yield bill every week between now and, yep.
So there's a presentation, a slide deck on the committee page under my name. I think it's titled Yield Bill Decision Points. This will likely look familiar to those of you who were on the committee last year. And I think added a little bit more just to be especially clear. So is that screen great? So again, nonpartisan. I've tried to compile these decision points as some of that really high level decision points that you all typically grapple with each year when considering the yield bill. So as we know, there's a number of policy decisions that need to be made each year for the yield bill. Essentially, what the yield bill is it determines how to raise funds for the education fund after accounting for all of the uses and all of the non-property tax revenue streams. So you'll recall that the way that we determine how much needs to be raised on property taxes, all else equal, is we take the total expenditures out of the education fund, fill up that stabilization reserve, and then we subtract the non-property revenue sources, and the remainder is what needs to be raised somehow. And absent another policy decision, it's raised through property taxes. How it's raised, either from other revenue sources, from homestead property taxes or non-homestead property taxes, is a policy choice that you all will need to determine. And I've put together some really high level questions to provide context, but again, it's not exhaustive. So big picture, the yield bill decision points, you need to figure out how to fill the education fund to ensure that we can pay all of the expenditures that have been determined. So you have the question of non-property tax revenue. Should there be one-time money used to lower property taxes? You'll recall in the past 2 years, there's been a general fund transfer of one-time money. 2 years ago, 25 million. Last year, a little over 77 million. In addition to that, the General Assembly has used education fund surplus dollars over the past years since I've been here to lower property taxes each year. Another question that you're confronted with is if the non-property revenue streams that go into the education fund should be changed. A couple years ago, there was the short-term rental surcharge that was added to the education, that was added on top of the meals and rooms tax and dedicated fully to the education fund. An important piece of or caveat to keep in mind here in terms of non-property tax revenue sources is that dependent on that revenue source, it may not be able to be properly implemented in the coming fiscal year. So we may not get the returns that you're looking for in that upcoming fiscal year. And then on the same note, should new non-property tax revenues be added to the education fund? So those are some of the big picture non-property revenue source questions.
Is that the short-term rental income, is that on a different line on the outlook?
It's included in the outlook. It's been rolled into the meals and rooms tax line. I'm happy to come back, or my colleague Ted Barnett could come back and talk about its performance since it was implemented. It gets to this constant question of what do we break out in the Ed Fund outlook and what don't we? I'm always trying to keep it on one page. So that's why it's been.
Yes. So the other night we had a presentation on all this TIP district stuff and the CHIP and all that. And one of the points that one of the speakers kept making was that then after a certain length of time, money comes back to the government and it gets dumped into the Ed Fund. Where does that money show on our income line, revenue line?
So, so this is one of those broader questions or conversation topics about CHIP and TIF. I will admit I'm not the CHIP and TIF expert in JFO. So if we want to go weedy, I need to tag in Ted to talk about that. Big picture, there's the question of how grand list value is going to be increased in the state of Vermont, right? So would that grand list value be added even if one of these incentive programs didn't exist? Or is that grand list value only being added because of the incentive program? And essentially the way to think about it is the bigger the grand list, the more property that we are able to tax for the education fund, the less we need to raise from each individual person because we have a broader base. So the thought would be if for whatever reason, there is a growth in grand list value, those that are not experiencing the growth in their grand list value are not going to need to pay as much into the education fund, all else equal. So in terms of the education fund outlook, if you're looking at the Ed Fund outlook, there's not going to be a specific line where you're going to be seeing that. Does that answer your question?
Not really, but because I still don't know. So where does that money go? Goes into the income that we get from property tax on that?
So in the incentive program, those tax revenues are not going into the education fund because that is the incentive.
And so
Yeah.
once then once the incentive ends,
Yes.
the Ed Fund
Bigger.
is hypothetically, if things go according to plan, then that property becomes taxable again. And
Yes.
it's just like any other property.
I understand
Yeah.
that, but isn't there some cash revenue
No,
that people would pay for tax?
they would be paying the property taxes on properties that are now taxed at full value.
Okay. All right.
If folks are about to enter into a debate about CHIP and
No,
TIF,
no,
okay,
no,
great.
I wanna say
Representative
there's-
Burkhart.
So mine is more about the Ed Fund outlook, and Madam Chair, I wanted to
Yes.
ask if this is the right time to ask a question specifically about the Ed Fund.
Let's give it a
outlook.
go.
So my question, Julia, is sort of a follow-up to Representative Brannigan's question, which is in that line where you say what groundless growth is assumed to be year after year, are you changing how you calculate, or how, I guess I should just ask, how do you calculate what that assumed percentage groundless growth is from year to year? And are you factoring in something different now that CHIP is in place in terms of that groundless growth that's generating profit?
So that estimate that I pulled up the Ed Fund Outlook, which is also on the committee page under my name. We see that here in line I, just to level set. That is coming from the tax department's equalization study. So any question about how the equalization study has or hasn't changed because of CHIP or TIF, I would need to defer to Jake or Jill or others at tax.
And they're gonna come in with that soon. Okay. Yeah, Representative Woody.
So just in the interest of answering Carolyn's question, couldn't I be divided with groundless growth without CHIP, groundless growth, the additional groundless growth with CHIP? Because there is going to be there's going to be some increased revenue even from the start.
We hope.
I think that comes back to how effective CHIP is. And I think that gets back to the question of the but-for test. How do you break out that growth in the grand list, right? You'll recall the but-for test. Would that development happen but for the incentive program? That being said, certainly the grand list growth could be broken out into, a ton of lines by municipality or whatever category within the equalization study. I would encourage you to flag those questions for when tax comes in about the equalization study, because they'll be able to speak to that in more detail.
Thank you.
If I can real quick, so you mentioned the short-term rental tax is now in the rooms and meal line, correct?
Correct.
Now,
Yep.
wasn't there a cloud tax as well?
Yeah, so the cloud tax, which is what it was referred to, was really the repeal of an exemption on those services. I forget the products, I forget the special title for them, but basically, the repeal of an exemption, so sure, a tax, and that would be included in our sales and use line.
Thank you.
That's something else we could come back and talk about. That would be helpful.
Hosted software.
Sorry?
Cloud hosted software.
Cloud hosted software per Rep Kimball.
And maybe you'll address this, but a lot of folks have asked me, so the current use program, I think is around $76 million. Where does that show up in, an expenditure for it and then the state coming back in, or, it being picked up again?
So the education component, the education property tax component of current use, right? There's two components of it. The education property tax component, again, we don't see a line here. I think it was either last year or a couple years ago for one or two of the Ed Fund outlooks, I did include the current use. That's really a tax expenditure. So we can think about it as we're not collecting as much property tax revenue from those properties, so we need to collect it elsewhere, all else equal. And that would be included here in a source as a tax expenditure, similar to the property tax credit.
Okay, thanks.
And it's an exemption, not a credit, so I'm totally.
I think one of the things that's, I think there's a philosophical debate about current use, about whether it is really an exemption or whether it is an appropriate valuation of that land. And the agriculture, food, and the agriculture committee last session spent a great deal of time taking testimony on current use, partly because we asked them to do that in the context of the education fund. And we're sort of looking at places to change it in order to better sort of meet current day needs. And they decided not to make any changes. We can get some more testimony on it. I know other people on the committee are interested in that.
Thank you.
The other piece that I would add about that is the PBR annual report. I don't think you've taken testimony on that yet, but that has a really excellent chapter every year that talks about current use in great detail and how it's changed over time. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in current use, to a good starting place is that annual report.
Thank you.
There's, if I may add, there's just two elements. One is the net education property tax for homestead, non-homestead reflects what is foregone and the tax expenditure for current use, but there's also a $20 million appropriation for the municipal hold harmless.
And that's out of the general
The
fund.
general fund, yes. So it's 50 million in the education fund, 20 million or so
Okay, great. Okay.
in the general
That
fund.
gets you that 70-some million.
Yeah.
Okay,
Total.
thanks.
We should let PBR know that people have talked about it multiple times a day, every day since the session started, and we're so excited to have them in.
Yeah.
Julia, back to you.
Okay, I'm gonna pivot away from the outlook, but it still is there. We need to go back. So we just spoke about non-property tax revenue as one of the big questions for you all to grapple with in terms of the yield bill.
Yeah, I didn't realize you were pivoting. So I think one thing that would be helpful to think about is what's happening with those revenue streams. Some of them are growing, some of them are growing slowly, some of them are likely to deteriorate. And it might be good to have a sense of each of those funding streams and what we think is likely, because some of them are going to do better than others.
And I think I think Friday, after the e-board, we have a meeting with Tom. And it might be helpful for us to focus our questions on ed fund revenue sources when he comes in. And if you want to be responsible for remembering for us to do that, that would be awesome. Thank you.
And to that end, after the updated revenue forecast, that's when we'll come back with an updated education fund outlook that will show the new forecasted non-property revenue streams. The other intuition there to keep in mind is and I spoke about this a little bit in the all-member briefing, and then I think I shared the graph with the committee. When non-property revenue streams are growing by 1, 2, 3%, if education spending is growing at 5%, property taxes need to make up a larger and larger share because the growth is at a different rate. The other piece here in terms of non-property tax revenue that's worth keeping in mind is the more one-time money that is used in one year, the larger of a gap the next year needs to make up, right? So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the estimated growth that we're seeing this year is because over 100 million in one-time money was used last year to buy down last year's or this year's property taxes. Then another big question that you're going to be grappling with in the yield bill is the property tax revenue. So how much should be raised on homestead property tax and how much should be raised on non-homestead property tax? The December 1 letter requires JFO and tax to solve it so that the average bill change across those three classes is uniform, meaning that non-homestead average bills increase at the same or decrease at the same rate that homestead bills do. We need to do that for the December 1 modeling. You don't need to do that in the yield bill. That's a policy choice. That's a policy choice that you did make last year, and that doesn't bind you to make the same this year. You could, you couldn't, it's up to you. This is the next, and we usually use the average bill change to talk about how much we're raising in homestead and non-homestead property, because that's the best proxy we've been able to find in terms of how much liability, the change in liability on the two different groups. Of course, it is just an average. And we don't want to look, for instance, at rates because bases are changing. The bases are different. Another big question has to come to income sensitivity.
I was just gonna say, if we could dedicate a session just to talk about that, because there's so many moving parts there.
Talking about what? I'm sorry.
About how, I think the base is changing, the rates are changing, we've got some issues around the weights. Things are moving, people are trying to figure out the difference between still, long-term weighted ADM, and believe it or not, equalized pupils are still coming up. So I just think people are so confused, it would be worth it.
About that part of current law.
Yes, to just go through that. Because even in here, I'm hearing things that are confused.
Another big question has to come to income sensitivity and the property tax credit. So you'll recall the homestead property tax has the income sensitivity component, the property tax credit. One of the big questions is how to set the income yield. So you're setting the homestead yield and the non-homestead uniform rate. There's also the income yield, which is used to calculate the property tax credits that are then on a lag, right? So they're going to be showing up in then the following fiscal year. So should the income yield be set in such a way so that the income sensitized folks have the same average bill change as homestead, or should it be different? That's a policy decision. Oh, and I'm sorry, as I said, I reused this slide and I didn't update the fiscal years. So that's my bad. I'll update that and I will follow up with Sorsha. But the question is, should the property tax credit earned in what this should say, earned in fiscal year 26 and appearing on fiscal year 27 bills be adjusted? So you'll recall a couple of years ago, there was that one-time increase to the property tax credit. Property taxes were estimated to go up by, I think, 13 point something percent. And there was a policy choice made to increase that property tax credit one time for folks to soften the impact of that increase. So, of course, increasing the property tax credit means that money needs to come from somewhere. And lastly, I just wanted to put a couple other pieces in here because they pertain to policy decisions that have been made in previous years. Should education fund expenditures be adjusted? Right? The education fund expenditures are really what's underlying how much needs to be raised from revenues. So that's one question. And then another question is, should any funds be reserved for future years? So in the last few years, there was a significant ed fund surplus. So there was money reserved for PCB remediation, and there was also money reserved for offsetting tax rates. Both of those reserves have been depleted. So this would be a choice to put more money into reserve for future fiscal years.
As part of the last one, I think we really need to have better data on school-based Medicaid, particularly as it interacts with the weights, because, and then also with changes in federal policy, I feel like there's very significant risk there that no one is talking about, and the task is we're unable to get numbers to even discuss or evaluate the impact.
Lori Houghton and I are co-sponsoring a bill about it. And so as a couple of things work through, we can
I
bring in
think we just
testimony
need
for
to
that.
know, because if, I mean, at the most.
We're at the most basic, we're probably leaving money on the table.
No, at the most basic level, we could bring down the entire state mental health system, because if the weights make it cheaper for districts to offer in-house, there is no reason to go to the DA and they lose the Medicaid match. I just think we need to really be careful. Yeah,
Yeah, that might be possible. I think there's a lot of complexity there and we can.
there's a lot of complexity there.
Absolutely. And we're asking about that in the context of education fund expenditures?
Absolutely.
Okay,
because
great.
it affects whether
Thanks.
we're using Medicaid or.
Yep. Representative Maslin?
Yes, Representative Holcomb, thank you for bringing this topic about lack of data from AOE up over and over again, because it needs to be, needs to be made frequently, because we're really at a disadvantage here. All of us are at a disadvantage. Schools are at a disadvantage. I'm trying to figure this out. So just to restate, and I should speak up, so.
And when, after Julia's testimony, we are going to hear from the Agency of Education with some data that they are bringing to us.
That's
about
good.
Spending, and we can learn what they have. Yes. Julia,
That's everything I prepared for yield bill decision points.
okay. So really want to make sure that we are taking the testimony we need to make about all the various levers. I think, I'll just say this frankly, I think sometimes folks who are not on this committee come to the members of this committee with somewhat magical thinking about the yield bill. And that it is, Julia describes it as a balloon sometimes. You squeeze one part, something else pops out somewhere else. And so we need to be also able to communicate with our colleagues that there's no magic solutions here. You need to put money in if money is spent, and there are only so many options for doing that. We have a bill on our wall to move purchase and use out of the education fund. If we do that, it needs to be made up with other revenue. There's no magic. And so just like really helping as much as everyone here, like ask for the testimony you need about those decision points so that we can both do our work in here and do our work out there. Yeah.
Probably shouldn't raise this, but you mentioned.
That's my favorite thing that people say before they speak.
Medicaid funds coming out of the education fund. Why do we do that? It's like kind of like the TIF. Why don't they come out of human service? Those types of.
Let's take testimony about that. Yeah.
Along that line,
Mhm.
I would like to suggest,
We can talk outside and then take testimony too.
Okay.
So Representative Odie, what were you gonna say?
so along that line, I'm thinking when we look at our per pupil costs in Vermont and it's compared to any other state, our costs look quite high per pupil. But in other states, there's general fund money being used for many things that we use our education fund for and that we count as per pupil expenditures here, for a Vermont student. So I wondered if we could look at what are other states taking from their general fund that are embedded in our education fund so that we can kind of look at that and consider how to deal with this going forward so that we have so we can have an apples to apples comparison. Maybe that is important, maybe it's not. Maybe so that we can say, well, what amount is reasonable to think would come from a general fund rather than an ed fund, and maybe structure things differently. I don't know if this would take a whole study committee or what this would take, but I think is a good idea.
And there are some great reports from the Education Commission of the states. Is that what ECS is?
So,
Yeah.
and look at the F-33 data and I'll share it with you and you can see what we spend on versus neighboring states.
And we are about to take testimony when we're done with Julia about what we're spending, what the districts are spending money on now. That'll be a great place to start.
Maybe, I just one last thing, because that's fine to say those things and that you would show me that, but I just think since it comes up in here, I wonder if we could all share learning about that. Because it's really used to bludgeon schools and school boards and education provision.
Much.
We spend so much, we aren't doing that well, so what are we really spending?
We're about to take testimony about what we're spending.
And on this one, I really like your idea of spending some dedicated time on this issue that.
The Medicaid issue. Yeah, absolutely, we will. Yes. Julia, you have two other presentations. I don't remember what they are.
Yeah, I was asked to put together a presentation about the excess spending threshold and then to update a couple of charts that I presented in this committee a couple of years ago. I'm happy to talk through those now or later. Okay. Both? Or do you want me to start somewhere?
Why don't you pick which one you start?
Okay, so I think we should start with there's two slides on the committee page under my name called the Education Fund Over Time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So these charts were put together to just for inflation to have a better sense of how the education fund has developed over the past years. So this first chart that I have here on slide 3 is showing the real education fund revenue over time, real meaning it's adjusted for inflation, been adjusted to 2017 dollars because that is what our state economists have based the inflation index of NIPA against. So what we're seeing here are the different revenue streams going into the education fund. The bottom 2 bars, green, are representing the property tax. The homestead property tax is net because it's factoring in the property tax credit. So the property tax credit has been subtracted out.
I'm so sorry. You said that you use NIPA to adjust.
Yes.
these? And, okay, and is there that report coming? Because that's a products inflator, not a.
Yeah, we're working on it, and when we have it ready, we will follow up. And I chose NIPA because that is the inflation index that's used throughout Title 16 with respect to the education fund.
Just a quick question. The federal money that came in for COVID, is that outside of these revenue sources someplace? Because I would have expected to see like a little boost of federal money in here someplace, but that's not included in.
Correct. This is the education fund, so this is solely talking about state dollars. I could come back and talk about federal money. The challenge is that a lot of federal money often flows directly to the district and not through the state. So this is looking at the state education fund. That being said, I don't want to postulate about why or why not the education fund was a certain size or why revenues needed to be raised. And we can look at the COVID years in the chart and see the adjusted state revenues.
The spending when ed funds to some degree when all that federal money was here. And I bet there is definitely a correlation, but that both of those things are happening.
Both of those things happened. I don't know. Correlation, causation, I don't know. I will say that I know the Agency of Education has, or their consultants, I don't remember, published some charts that showed funding, all education funding in the state, including federal funds. So perhaps they can speak to it after.
I was gonna ask if there was, another chart that showed all school budgets adjusted for inflation. Because my sense anecdotally is that school budgets didn't really shrink during COVID. If anything,
No,
they went much higher. And I just wondered how,
And I went into, I was hunting for a vague memory of a colored pie chart the other day, like deep inside the past. And I looked at a lot of the testimony that the Education Finance Subcommittee of the Future Public Education Committee took. And there was a lot of testimony about those cost drivers that included the semester fund discussions. And so that was we took a lot, and we also took testimony about that in like 2023, maybe. And it's usually under Nicole Lee's name if you also want to go into the deep hunt. I never found the actual colored pie chart that I was hunting for, but maybe someday it'll turn up.
Julie, can you talk about the rationale in 2019, fiscal year 2019, about moving all of the sales and use tax and getting away from the general fund transfer? You know, the reasoning behind that, all state funds are fungible in a sense, as the yellow is creeping back in, as you can see. But so can you speak to the decision why that was made?
I can't speak to the decision as to why it was made because it was a policy choice. That being said, a couple of pieces that might be helpful. I'll start out with one. JFO was required to publish a report, and we did it, and I'll send it to Sorcia to send around to the committee later, that talks about the impact of the revenue shift, that change that happened in 2018 of exactly what you're talking about, getting rid of the general fund transfer, changing the underlying revenue streams into the education fund. So
That was just last year that report came out, right?
I think it was 2 years ago.
Okay.
I'll just remind the committee that what we saw in FY 2018, what we saw in 2018 was a bill was passed that changed the revenue going into the education fund. So that's why we see the change of the general fund transfer, this bright yellow box sitting here at the top go down after FY 2018. At the time, it was considered, the Cliff Notes version of the report is at the time it was considered to be a revenue neutral shift. However, there was the Wayfair decision that followed just after. So the education fund actually ended up seeing an increase in sales and use revenue that wasn't anticipated when that was determined to be revenue neutral.
Representative Holcomb.
I think for policy context, the fiscal year 17 budget used 40 million in unallocated education surplus to buy down the tax rate. And that was also the next year was when the body decided to move teacher contracts to the state level. And this was.
Teacher healthcare contract?
Yes, smoothing that. So this was, I think, a byproduct of that larger conversation.
Representative Bodie.
Are we going to look at what the statewide negotiated healthcare costs contracts look like for the cost of those and what they're projected to be in the next few years?
We're going to talk about costs in the education fund, so I imagine health insurance will come up, yes. We're not going to go deep into the negotiated contracts.
No,
But-
just
okay,
like
yes,
what-
yeah, I imagine that will be part of the testimony that we're going to get from AOE in a second.
Budgeting 7%.
Yes.
Okay, we can look at
Representative
all these things,
Mhm.
but in the end, what can we do?
Such a great question, Representative Page. Thank you. That's very clarifying. Agreed. And that's the sort of decision points that Julia laid out, right? Yeah.
One more chart that I've updated.
Sorry. I want to answer that a little more thoroughly. I think to some degree, the reason that we explore the cost drivers that we can't do anything about is so that the rest of the body will know that we explored the cost drivers and decided that we can't do anything about some of them and that we're trying to do something about others. And so to some degree, there are cost drivers that we're aware we can't do anything about that we're probably going to spend a little bit of time talking about just to make that explicitly clear. I don't know if I should have said that on the record, but I did. Yes.
Madam Chair, and I hate to bring this up now, but maybe to answer the representative's question to some degree, what can we do? I mean, I'd be interested to know, and as I'm sure you're all aware, there's a particular bill in the House and there's one in the other body in regards to a freeze, so to speak, on education tax at the time, and I'd at least like to know how that would work. So.
We will absolutely have Representative Galfetti in to introduce her bill. Yes.
Mechanics of it.
Yeah, right.
My understanding is it could actually increase people's tax bills sometimes, but we will take testimony on it. Julia.
So the other chart here in the slide deck, this is also an updated chart. What we're looking at here again are these, the dollar figures. So these two, if you can see colors, they're blue lines, they're the flatter ones. These are representing real appropriations out of the education fund. Again, these figures have been adjusted by NIPA to 2017 dollars. And these correspond with the left-hand axis in terms of millions of dollars. This declining line that's red is representing the long-term average daily membership. So essentially the number of kids in schools each year. And this corresponds with our right-hand axis. So what we see is the number of students in schools are decreasing over time.
That's of course not adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, right. I don't know how you would adjust kids for inflation.
You could also change the axis.
It might be bigger.
And I will note the axis here doesn't start at 0, starts at 80,000 to show the trend.
There are no questions, just bad jokes. We move on to the next slide.
Okay, there's no more slides in that slide deck.
Let's go to the next one.
Okay,
Okay.
so the last new slide deck that's on the committee page under my name is the excess spending adjustment. So we're pivoting a little bit from looking at the education fund writ large and all of the ins and outs, or some of the ins and outs, and now focusing on one specific tax mechanism that exists within our system, the excess spending adjustment.
And to be clear, I asked you to discuss this partially because it's one of the things that we do in order to try to keep costs contained to some degree, or to keep spending contained. Doesn't contain costs, it contains spending to some degree. And it shifts taxes in ways that could be considered sort of more, I don't know, I'm not gonna finish my sentence, Julia.
Okay. So I've separated this into two chunks. First, we're going to talk about the excess spending adjustment under current law. So how does it currently work? What is the landscape that we're working within? And then briefly talking about the history of the excess spending threshold and adjustment. So under current law, we have something called the excess spending adjustment. What it is it increases a district's tax rate if it spends above the excess spending threshold. So essentially what that means is for the amount that a district spends on over that threshold, there is a double tax on that amount they are spending above the threshold.
Madam Chair, if I can, so, and maybe you'll clarify this, but that really only goes to the homestead tax rate, correct?
Yes. So thank you. We'll recall that, and we will talk about the formula a little bit more detail, but level setting, the homestead property tax rate is set by taking a district's per weighted pupil education spending and dividing it by the statewide yield. That varies by district, while the non-homestead rate does not vary by district. So this is only focusing on that homestead property tax rate.
Thank you.
And income sensitivity. So the excess spending threshold is calculated annually, and for FY 27, which is the yield bill year that we're talking about right now, the threshold is 16,470. We'll talk through what that means and how that number is calculated. Now, we will talk about that. So that is calculated. So this is written into statute. And this was implemented a couple of years ago. We'll talk about the history of when this was implemented. The way that the way this threshold is calculated is we take the AOE takes the average FY 25 per pupil spending for the state, increases it by inflation by NIPA, which is the inflation index we have in Title 16, and then multiplies it by 118%. So I've included the average per pupil spending amount that's used or that existed in FY 25. So this 13,168 is what sits in this part of the equation. So that's calculated each year.
Sorry, Representative Maslin.
Can you remind us why it's 118%?
That was a policy choice.
That's just, thank you.
We'll get to the history at the end of the slides, but spoiler alert, it used to be 121% on a different base. And they're not directly comparable because there has been an underlying funding change, underlying change to the funding formula.
Thank you.
I'm trying to understand the NIPA, the use of NIPA based on a comment that you just made, and I could be totally off here. But if that's pegged to goods and services, even though it's used throughout Title 16, but 80% of what schools spend on is personnel, how do we deal with that?
So Julia's writing a report that's about inflators and the Ed Fund, and we are going, when she's done with it, we will have a robust conversation about inflators that I'm excited, everyone's so excited about. Because we had Joyce come in and give a presentation on inflators 2 years ago that I thought was thrilling, but maybe not everyone else did. So I'm glad that people are getting more and more excited about inflators as time is going on. Julia.
So essentially what this, the 1+ NIPA is essentially saying that we're increasing it, right? 100% plus whatever the inflation is.
And so was it then a policy choice that we were only doing it times 1 year of inflation, even though we're taking FY 25?
So it's not, so perhaps this is a little misleading. It is not 1 year of inflation. It's 1 plus whatever the inflation is. So for
For
instance,
2 years.
exactly. So in FY 27, the excess spending threshold is calculated by taking the average spending of 13,168, increasing it by inflation, NIPA inflation from FY 25 to FY 27, and then multiplying it by 118. So assuming this still exists in FY 30, the NIPA adjustment will be FY 25 to FY 2030. Moving on. There's one exemption to the excess spending adjustment in current law. This is for all principal and interest payments for any approved bonds that were approved prior to July 1, 2024. And this date was chosen because it represented decisions that had already been made prior to the unfreezing of the excess spending threshold.
I think there's a question about whether it makes sense for that to be July 1st, 2024 or December 31st, 2024, given that bonds could have sort of been in process, but not completely made, sort of throughout that year. Because the November vote was sort of part of that. And so I just want to flag that as something that might need a little bit of tweaking.
You'll be seeing a bill to change that.
I think there's gonna be able to change a lot of it, and that's just a tiny piece that I'm talking about. That's really still within the exact same legislative intent rather than different legislative intent. Yeah, I agree with that. Representative Faulkner.
I just think that in the vein of the 3% cap, anything that we do that is sort of an arbitrary point in time has disruptive and arbitrary impacts. And it's worth thinking about that.
So this exemption that exists currently and could be changed, would be a policy choice to change it. But as it exists currently, does not decrease the general education spending that's used to calculate a homestead property tax rate. It only impacts determining the amount, how much is over the threshold. So it's adjusting that amount over the threshold to determine the amount that's double taxed or subject to the adjustment. And any amount that qualifies under this exemption is exempt from that double tax. So how does it work? Are we good? How does it work? We've already talked, I think we've already really spoken about this, but essentially what we do is we look at how much the AOE looks at how much a district's per pupil spending is greater than the excess spending threshold, which is a per pupil amount, determines how much is over that threshold after accounting for exemptions, and however much is over that threshold after accounting for exemptions is essentially added back onto per pupil spending to double count it. So this is the way that that formula looks. So we know that that excess spending is already sitting in the education spending, and then we add it in the second time, which is where that double taxation happens. So it's not all education spending that's being double taxed within that district, only the amount that's over the threshold.
Can you talk about the dynamics of sort of when some districts do this, it pays for itself, and when some districts do this, there's still more ed fund spending separate from their district spending that.
Yeah. So we know that there's 119 school districts in the state with really varied grand list value. And so this is one of those challenges when thinking about an illustrative example. It really depends on the district. So there's some districts where if that district has a significant grand list value, the higher the tax rate on that district, the more money that's being raised from that district going to the statewide education fund. Other districts that have less grand list value within that district, while they may have a higher tax rate, or they will have a higher tax rate, they're not going to be raising the same amount from their grand list because their grand list is smaller. So dependent on the size and scale of the district, will depend how much money is being raised from that double taxation, right? Because that tax is being applied to a different base dependent on the district. And really what we do see here as well is this is shifting liability in the state. We spoke about in the first slide deck how all else equal, there's a certain amount that needs to be raised from property taxes, absent a different policy choice. And the question is, where is it raised? And this is saying more is going to be raised from the districts that are spending above the threshold, which then means less is raised from the districts that are spending below the threshold. However, the district spending above the threshold may not be raising, likely won't be raising all of that money locally.
So how does that work? Had me until the very end. I'm thinking of, say, Jay and Westfield, and I think Jay is being hit by the excess spending penalty and Westfield is not. But they actually go to school side by side all the way through. They belong to the same districts, the middle and the high school level. So the excess spending will be applied to Jay because once you apply the weights, it will be a high spender, but Westfield will not. So how does that work? It's not about the district, it's about the town that's paying.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'll send you the numbers. I'll send you the numbers. Maybe you can come back and explain.
Okay. So my brain works better with numbers than words. I think some of yours do as well. So I put together this table that's really just a number, very simple, totally made up number example that walks through how this would or wouldn't impact the tax rate of a district. So we have two example districts, District A, District B. I made them up. They don't exist. I made up their per pupil spend, so their per weighted pupil education spending, right? Education spending divided by long-term weighted average daily membership. District A and District B. And so then the first step is to calculate the excess spending threshold. Let's pretend that we use that equation of calculating the threshold and we get 16,000. That's the threshold. So then the next step is to look at how much is over the threshold within those districts. So District A has a per pupil spend below the threshold, so they have $0 over the threshold. District B has 1,000 over the threshold. Then we need to double tax that amount that's over the threshold. We're going to say that District B has no exemptions in that 1,000. Add that amount over the threshold to the district's per pupil education spending. So District A, of course, has no adjustment. District B increases its per pupil ed spend for the purpose of its property tax calculation from 17,000 to 18,000. And then we use that amount that we've calculated here in step 3 or row 4 to calculate the tax rate. Here I've assumed a yield of 9,000 because it's a round number. It's also made up. In District A, we do the normal calculation and get a tax rate of $1.67. And in District B, we use that adjusted per pupil spending to get a tax rate of $2. If this final row here, row 6, is showing what the tax rate would be if no excess spending adjustment were to exist. It's important to know here, I'm still assuming the same yield, right? We just spoke about the fact that the yield or the allocation of funds may differ or will differ with an excess spending adjustment. But using the same yield, we see that District B's tax rate would decrease, of course, because we're no longer adding in that additional $1,000 of excess spending.
There's one sentence at the end that I didn't understand that you said from the page before. More raised from school districts above the threshold, but won't raise the money locally most. I'm confused because I thought that, can you just explain because when you look at the $2 versus the $1.89, it is more money and that is local.
Yeah, so there's more money being raised from that homestead tax rate. What I was talking about is the fact that we have a statewide education fund. So a local homestead property tax rate is not raising the district's entire budget. It's proportional to their spending decisions. And it's not it doesn't function as a municipal tax would, where it's all of that money is being raised for that district.
Yeah, I see that it's not all being raised for the district, but there's a direct tax impact locally.
Absolutely.
All right, so it is meant to, yeah, it's a disincentivizing spending above the threshold. That's what I thought, okay. So won't raise the money locally most, because it's going to get, okay, I see what you mean by that. Okay, thank you.
I have a math question. So when you were talking before, the excess spending, you were saying it would be multiplied by 2 and then added to the per pupil spending,
It would be,
the amount over the threshold.
it's either multiplied by, it's either double that amount or added to the excess spending.
Okay, so in your example in District B,
Mhm.
so 17,000, 16 is the threshold, 1,000 is the amount over. I was assuming it would be 1,000 times 2 added to the 17, not to the 16.
It's already in the 17.
It's included here in this 17,000, so it's the 17,000 that exists in the education spending plus the amount over.
So it's getting taxed once as part of the 17, and then it gets taxed again as the extra 1,000
Okay,
gets added
all
on
right.
and taxed.
That just gets added on, not multiplied. Okay.
Yes.
For some reason, I thought it would be multiplied.
Then the example worked because it clarifies something.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the example how it works. In FY 26, so this was last year's yield bill, it's the year that we're in right now. The excess spending threshold was 15,926, and there were 6 school districts that exceeded this threshold. I went and looked, and the range was $429 over per pupil over the threshold. So that was the lowest of the districts above the threshold, and the highest was 1,582 per weighted pupil. So these were the amounts in those districts that were being added on top of their district per pupil.
Not per people.
Yeah. So that was under current law. Now we're,
I'm sorry,
look back.
fiscal year 26, thank you. Okay.
Right now, we don't know what is the case in fiscal year 27 because we don't have the budget information nor the weighted pupil counts for FY 27.
But we will, as the session goes on, before we pass the yield bill, we'll have a lot more information, including some of those details.
Yes. Now we're looking back. So this we already spoke about, but back in Act 127 of 2022, the excess spending threshold was frozen from FY 25 through FY 29. And then 2 years later, Act 183 was passed and unfroze the excess spending threshold and then amended it. And it needed to be amended because the funding formula changed in Act 127. So in addition to those necessary amendments, there were policy decisions that were also made in Act 183. So those, I'm not sure. Oh, I do talk about what it was beforehand. Great. So prior to Act 183, the excess spending threshold was calculated by taking the FY 15 average education spending per pupil, per equalized pupil, adjusting it by inflation, and then multiplying it by 121%. So this is how the threshold was calculated. There are also a lot of exemptions to the excess spending threshold. Act 183 did away with all of those exemptions and then just implemented the one that we spoke about. Beth St. James put together an amazing slide outlining all of the exemptions that she was able to locate prior to that, and I've linked to it here.
So there was no excess spending threshold for a few years of sort of pandemic time. And we're talking now about what was sort of in law and active before that.
Yeah, thank you. So the excess spending threshold, I should have included this, was first suspended during the pandemic. And then it was with the funding change further suspended in Act 127. and then ultimately reinstated in Act 183. So I spoke about this earlier. I do want to caution comparison of looking at the excess spending threshold pre Act 183 and post, because it was using a different funding formula, using different exemptions than exist under current law. And I included this here in case it was helpful. What we're looking here is the historical excess spending threshold pre-Act 183 in Vermont. This is data that's available on AOE's website, so you can grab the data yourself if you're interested. And what we're seeing here is that it's spending per equalized pupil. So you'll recall this is a change of how pupils are counted. This was changed in Act 127. And then, of course, it was suspended.
I really appreciate you indicating when it's equalized spending and weighted spending, because people at home are super confused about that. And we sometimes just talk about per pupil spending and it's weighted spending, and they can't tell if we're talking weighted or just unweighted. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks. And I do think to that end, something that's important or helpful to keep in mind is technically the legal term per pupil spending means education spending per weighted pupil. And that can also be conflated with education spending per kid. So,
And because we changed the way we weight it from equalized to long-term weighted, there's still that tail that's showing up in budget books, and people are still confused because they're conflating them someplace.
And it was confusing before, and that's still confusing, and people will be confused.
It's good to minimize confusion.
Absolutely. Can we look at the exemption list? That Beth.
yeah. So this is Beth. This is not my slide deck, so I'm not going to speak to it. And she put this together. Here are the list of all of the exemptions that she located.
A little. So many attorney words.
Starting in 2009.
I don't want to comment on her slides.
Yes.
And it is hot link in the slide deck, so you all can link to it yourself too. That was the easy part.
Very helpful.
She said multiple times, the problem is every good intention creates unintended consequences.
Have I said that? I think you say that, but I do agree with the spirit. Yes. And I think we all know that like it's a legislative skill to get an exemption for your district into statute, and the longer a statute sits there, the more exemptions get sort of piled in that might even cancel each other out sometimes. Who knows? Like that's just part of, the Band-Aids and masking tape that we put on the law to hold it all together or pull it apart. Yeah.
I need to step out. I'll be right back.
Great. Enjoy yourself.
But
Okay, we're gonna take a break I guess now, actually. That was your last slide?
I'm done.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Julia? Great, so we're gonna take a break until 10:20 and then pick up with the Agency of Education.